What's up, YouTube? Brad Hoover from Rants here. As always, guys, if y'all enjoy our content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave that comment down below. All right, so there's a lot of things that I felt like Game of Thrones did get wrong, at least from the books. Um, let's face it, the last season was incredibly rushed. Kind of felt like a lot of the characters weren't going anywhere. Um, you know, Tyrion Lannister is probably the prime example of that. And then all of a sudden, it felt like the characters that were beloved by a lot of fans, kind of got screwed over at the end. They completely and totally changed everything and of who they were. And so, yeah, I kind of believe that to a certain extent, like this CBR article is asking this question: did Game of Thrones uh, fail to capture Daenerys Targaryen's genius? I would say yes and no on this one, but let's read this article just to see if it convinces me. I definitely think they got the character wrong. Don't get me wrong. I don't know about the genius of her character if they got it wrong, but I do believe that they definitely did get who she was and what she stood for completely and totally wrong. All right, it says many plots in Game of Thrones were forced to simplify storylines and character arcs from A Song of Ice and Fire, leaving entire characters and histories on the cutting room floor. Even the very nature of a live action adaptation of the story portrayed in prose means the fans lose out on the rich internal world of the characters that serve as a point of view narrators in the novels. And perhaps no character had the complexity of their abilities more simplified than Daenerys Targaryen. Hmm. While Daenerys' adaptation is in the HBO series still portrayed a strong and capable leader, the changes made in the adaptation left the depth of her thoughts and actions out. The result was a far more impulsive and straightforward leader. Now, that, yes, I actually do agree with that. But if Game of Thrones made the character more like she was in A Song of Ice and Fire, she could have been one of the keenest queens in the series. I kind of felt like in the books that she was almost, and I don't mean this in a negative light, I almost kind of felt like she was like a younger version of Cersei Lannister. And I'm not saying that she was as evil as what Cersei was, but I'm talking about just the cunning aspect. You're talking about a really male driven world, and Cersei was able to maneuver herself and her family to be the strongest in all of Westeros. I kind of felt like Daenerys kind of had that feeling as well, and I do actually agree with the fact when they say she was far more impulsive in the series than what she was in the books. It seemed like in the books, it's like she thought things through. She she contemplated and she moved according to really good wisdom in a lot of different ways. Where in the book, in the series, it just kind of was like, okay, I'm rashly going here and I'm rashly doing this. It didn't really feel that way in the books. I said certain changes were made for Daenerys' on-screen adaptation right from the introduction of her character, but would immediately have consequences on how the character grew throughout her arc. The biggest initial change was the aging up of the character for Game of Thrones. Nearly an adult at the age of 17 in the HBO series, and in her early 20s by the end of it. In the book, Daenerys starts out at only 13 years old, a change that certainly would have made her sexual entanglements wildly inappropriate for the more mainstream adaptation, but which reflects on her growth into a leader immensely. Now, as far as the aging up of the characters, this is actually a point that another point I actually agree with. I felt like they aged the characters, but they didn't really change, the aspects of the characters that were, like they instead of being 13, they looked like they were 20, but then they still acted like they were 13. And I'm talking mostly like about the Stark children. when you're talking about, let's say, I don't know, Jon Snow, or even Arya Stark in a lot of different ways. You're looking at, by the end of the series, a grown woman, but one that's still acting really irrationally, uh, compared to what she should by the age with the experience she has actually gone through. So I kind of feel like that I totally actually agree with too. I feel like they aged these characters up, but they didn't really change the person. I don't want to say change the personality, but change, the age of their thinking process. And that's something that I feel like completely and totally messed up Game of Thrones, really, in a lot of different ways throughout the entire series. But they had to, because you're going to have, an R-rated thing. You couldn't have Daenerys basically, doing all these sexual escapades and then her being 13. It just wouldn't have worked on screen. Totally get why they did what they did, but it just didn't work. It just really didn't work. Uh, though it can be easy to forget while reading the novels, Daenerys is only a teenager reaching adulthood as she grows into her role, yet her character in the books proves far more mature and considerate compared to her television counterpart. Throughout Game of Thrones, Daenerys' willful and principled nature pushes her into an increasingly impulsive characterization. Season 5, where many of the most drastic changes in the TV series began, Daenerys feeds former slavers to her dragons. Execution by dragon would become her go to method of justice, later using Drogon to immolate her prisoners of war and burning King's Landing to the ground in the final season. These actions were portrayed as instances of Daenerys' unflinching moralism, but in the end came across as a descent into madness, reflecting her father Aerys's insanity. Um, Look, I've got into a lot of arguments on Game of Thrones, fan sites about this thing where they're like, oh, well, she didn't actually go mad. Yes, she did. She totally did. She, like, burned men, women, and children. You can say that it was a principled action all you want, and that was just a moralism argument. But at the end, but what they were trying to convey is she had broke and she went mad. Uh, she had turned basically into her father at that point. That was why Jon Snow had to murder her simply because she was going to basically burn the world down. So, yeah. I mean, I don't know why that's so complicated for a lot of people to understand. They still want to buy into that's the same Daenerys that was in the beginning of the season or in the series. It wasn't. It really wasn't even the same Daenerys that was at the beginning of, let's say season 4. It just wasn't. She was a completely different person by that point. She had hit her breaking point, and just like her father, she broke, and was willing to take the world down with her. I never liked the way that they treated her in that regard. I felt like if you're going to go a descent into madness, you needed another season to do that in. Um, there was She was too much of a hero up to that point for a lot of people to just in a few episodes just be like, nah, she's actually the villain. That just wouldn't have, that just didn't fly with a lot of people, and I totally get that aspect of it. I just don't understand the fact of why people hold on to her heroism and try to justify her burning King's Landing. Like I never understood that. But anyways, it says, however, in the books, these events either do not happen or have yet to occur. I think it's going to occur in the books, but probably for different reasons. And unlike in the television series, the reader has insight into Daenerys' thoughts as her fearfulness out of following her father's path constantly guides her towards restraint rather than retribution. And that's a very good point. In that, if you say that it happens in the books, which I actually kind of believe that it will, um, that's going to be the most heartbreaking part of it. And it's going to feel heartbreaking because that restraint will then be gone and she will just be going into full fledged revenge mode. Daenerys frequently seeks out peaceful resolutions in the books, cultivates a wide range of allies, and much of her arc involves her clever navigation of complicated political plots. Now, I kind of feel like they did and didn't do that in the series as well, or at least they started off that way. She did get a large amount of allies. She was trying to go through um, peaceful ways of surrender and so forth by for her enemies, which made it all the more confusing when she was like, I'm just gonna burn people now." Like, I mean, it just felt out. It did actually truly feel out of place. Um, let's see, where was I at? With so many of these plots simplified in Game of Thrones or excised altogether, much of the nuance to Daenerys' decision making gets lost in the adaptation. One example would be Daenerys' arrival in Meereen, where outside the city gates she needed to select a champion to represent her in single combat against the opposing city. In the show, Daenerys simply chooses Dario Naharis in order to test his abilities. But in the books, Daenerys' own feelings for Dario uh, weigh against her desire to protect her trusted advisors, Barristan Selmy and Jorah Mormont. She ultimately selects a strong Bellis, a character missing from the show, but who serves as the perfect champion in the books. Since Bellis is a former slave, Daenerys knows that the Marinese would find no glory in killing the pit fighting champion. Ultimately, Bellis prevails, but the thought that goes into Daenerys' decision making process reflects the multiplicity of angles she considers. Such decisions are grossly oversimplified in the show and make the Khaleesi seem to put little consideration into her decisions. You know what? So far I agree with most of their points. I definitely feel like Daenerys was a watered down character of who she was in the books, especially that last season. I felt a lot like that with Jon Snow as well. I felt like Jon Snow. You talk about, he went from being honorable, honorable, honorable to being like, oh well, I'm actually in love, so I'm not gonna be honorable anymore, and I'm instead going to follow a tyrant instead of trying to save people. It didn't make any sense whatsoever. Uh, it wasn't the same Jon Snow that we knew, just like it wasn't the same Daenerys Targaryen that we knew, who went from caring about people and trying to avoid conflict to save lives to just being just throw it to the side and just being destructive for destructive sake in a lot of different ways. So yeah, I do actually believe there is a watered down version of Daenerys in Game of Thrones. She definitely isn't as complex of a character, and there's no doubt about it. The way she goes about situations, her thought process is different. She is thinking from multiple different angles in the book, where it seems like uh, she's more in, especially in the later seasons in Game of Thrones. She's driven more by who she is as a Targaryen. Like, she's the rightful heir, so anybody that goes against her is an enemy and therefore deserves to die because they're traitors. It's more complex than that, and they made it really simplified, and that did really seriously hurt the series. It says there is a tendency in the HBO series for those Daenerys seeks to win over to reverently bow themselves to her whenever she proves her seemingly divine right to rule. But the books cut her view to no such breaks. Practically every character and political party involved in the extremely diverse landscape of Essos seeks to use Daenerys to their own ends, constantly underestimating her and proving outwitted as she weighs her various counselors against her own sense of justice. Now that's another thing in the series. She just didn't really take the advice of her counselors in a lot of ways, and that got her in bad trouble. And when she did take the advice, and no doubt it made Tyrion into a complete and total idiot. But she did some really stupid things. Like she really got to the point where she just didn't trust anybody at that point. And there's a sense of lack of wisdom when it comes to that. It says there is and it goes on to say there is rampant speculation on whether the Daenerys of the books will ultimately end up going the same route her character in the show did, doomed to repeat her father's failures and arrive to Westeros as a violent conqueror rather than a diplomatic savior. Um, you know what? I kind of feel like she will, but it's going to be for different reasons. I think by the end, if George R.R. Martin finishes the books, I think fans are going to look at her downfall as quite sad. Quite sad and quite telling. I don't think they're going to be pissed. I think they're going to look at it and go, you know what? Sad what happened, but at the end of the day, it makes sense for her character to do that. I do think she will burn King's Landing. I do believe that is one thing she definitely will do. Uh, but I don't think it's going to be because she's pissed because someone killed her friend. I don't think it's going to be that way. I think she's going to be given no choice in the matter. It's either it might be her only way of taking the city, and she might have no you know chance of retreating. So she's kind of stuck there, and to save her people, she has to make a tough decision. I think that's the route that they'll probably go, or at least that's the route I hope they go. I hope they don't make her into full fledged villain. I think George R. R. Martin probably has learned his lesson. If he hasn't, he's crazy. I mean, you see the backlash from the show. Why would you write it exactly like what the show did? Like that'd be madness at that point. And it'd be a waste of George R. R. Martin's time to write it, and it would be a waste of people's time to read it if they did that. If he's just gonna just go off what the show's creators did, and we all know how terrible those last few seasons were, and I don't think George R. R. Martin was too happy with them either. But anyways, guys, let me know what y'all think. Do you feel like the show didn't exactly show her genius? I won't go so far to say genius, but she was definitely more complicated. Definitely more complicated of a character. Definitely a more interesting character overall. And it was a shame what they did to her, Jon Snow, Tyrion, and so forth. They completely ruined those characters. Completely ruined them. Anyways, guys, let me know what y'all think down below. As always, thanks for watching. Y'all take care.